At 38, Maribel Hayes was 7 months pregnant, nearly broke, and working double shifts as a housekeeper just to survive. Then, an unexpected inheritance changed everything. Her former employer left her an abandoned coastal cabin so rotten that everyone laughed and called it worthless. But hidden beneath its decaying floorboards was a secret treasure no one had discovered for decades. What Maribel found inside wouldn't just erase her poverty, it would reveal why the cabin had been left to her. Keep watching, because the final truth behind this hidden inheritance is something you won't see coming. At 38, Maribel Hayes had become frighteningly good at pretending she wasn't tired. Every morning at 4:40 long, before the winter sun touched the harbor of Rockport, Massachusetts, Maribel pushed herself out of bed in a tiny rented apartment above an aging laundromat. She would stand quietly beside the window, one hand pressed against her 7-month pregnant belly, waiting for the dizziness to pass. Then she went to work. By 6, she was cleaning the homes of people who rarely noticed her. She scrubbed their kitchens, changed their sheets, polished their furniture, and carried heavy baskets up staircases while her back screamed for rest. When the morning shift ended, another began. Maribel couldn't afford to stop. Her husband had died suddenly 3 years earlier, leaving her with medical debt, overdue bills, and a loneliness she never spoke about. The child growing inside her had arrived when she had almost given up believing she would ever become a mother. Every tiny movement beneath her ribs reminded her why she kept going. But love didn't pay rent, and Maribel was running out of time. She had less than $300 in savings. Her landlord had already warned her that the rent would increase after New Year's. Worse, her doctor had told her that continuing to work double shifts this late in pregnancy could put both her and the baby at risk. Still, she showed up, because Maribel had spent her entire life learning one cruel lesson. Poor people didn't get to collapse. They collapsed only after the work was finished. Then, on a freezing November afternoon, while Maribel was kneeling on the floor of an enormous seaside mansion, her phone began vibrating inside her apron. She almost ignored it. When she finally answered, an unfamiliar man's voice said, "Mrs. Hayes. My name is Elliot Mercer. I'm an attorney. I'm calling about your former employer, Beatrice Holloway." Maribel's hand froze around the cleaning cloth. Beatrice, the strange, reclusive widow Maribel had cared for years earlier, was dead. Maribel lowered herself into a chair, expecting to hear something about funeral arrangements. Instead, Elliot said something that made her forget how to breathe. "Mrs. Holloway mentioned you in her will." Maribel stared through the mansion's enormous windows at the gray Atlantic crashing against the rocks. There had to be a mistake. Beatrice had been wealthy once, but everyone knew most of her fortune had disappeared years ago. So why had she remembered a housekeeper? And why had she left Maribel something no one else in the family wanted? Maribel didn't know it yet, but the answer was waiting inside a forgotten building on the coast, a place so badly damaged that anyone with common sense would have walked away. But beneath its rotting floors, something had been waiting in silence for decades. And when Maribel finally found it, everything she believed about poverty, inheritance, and her unborn child's future would change forever. 3 days after the phone call, Maribel Hayes stood outside a small law office in downtown Rockport, staring at the brass handle as if opening that door might somehow divide her life into a before and an after. She almost turned around. Her morning cleaning shift had ended less than an hour earlier. Her feet were swollen inside worn black shoes. Her lower back throbbed, and the baby had been unusually restless all afternoon. She couldn't afford to lose another hour of work for something that was probably meaningless. But Elliot Mercer's words kept returning to her. "Mrs. Holloway mentioned you in her will." Maribel finally stepped inside. The conference room was colder than she expected. Around a polished mahogany table sat 3 members of Beatrice Holloway's family, all dressed in expensive dark clothing. Their eyes moved toward Maribel the moment she entered. No one smiled. A silver-haired man she recognized as Beatrice's nephew looked at her faded coat, then at her pregnant belly. "You're the housekeeper?" he asked. Maribel swallowed. "I used to work for Mrs. Holloway." The man leaned back without responding. That small gesture told her everything. Maribel chose the chair closest to the door. Elliot Mercer entered carrying a thick folder. After offering condolences, he began reading the will. Stocks went to one relative. Jewelry went to another. Several valuable paintings were divided among the grandchildren. Maribel listened silently, increasingly convinced she had been called there by mistake. Then Elliot stopped. He turned a page, and to Maribel Hayes, he read, "Who gave me kindness when kindness had become more valuable than money. I leave the property located at 17 Gull Point Road, together with the structure and all contents remaining therein." Silence filled the room. Maribel blinked. A property. Beatrice's nephew suddenly laughed. It wasn't a joyful laugh. "You mean the old fishing cabin?" Another relative shook her head. "That place is practically falling into the ocean." Maribel looked at Elliot. "What exactly did she leave me?" The attorney hesitated before sliding a photograph across the table. Maribel's heart sank. The picture showed a weather-beaten cabin standing alone near a rocky stretch of coastline several miles outside town. Its shingles were gray and warped. One window was boarded over. The porch leaned noticeably toward the ground. It didn't look like an inheritance. It looked like a demolition project. "The property has been vacant for approximately 24 years, Elliot explained. "There is significant salt and moisture damage. I strongly recommend having it inspected before making any decisions." The relatives exchanged amused glances. One of them whispered, just loudly enough for Maribel to hear, "She'll probably abandon it within a week." Heat rose into Maribel's face. But she said nothing. She had spent too many years cleaning up after people who believed silence meant weakness. Elliot handed her a small envelope containing the deed and an old brass key. Maribel closed her fingers around it. It was cold, heavy, and for reasons she couldn't explain, strangely important. The following morning, she borrowed her neighbor's aging pickup truck and drove toward Gull Point. The farther she traveled, the narrower the road became. Houses disappeared. Pine trees bent beneath the coastal wind, and the Atlantic stretched beyond them like an endless sheet of dark steel. Then she saw it. Number 17. Maribel pulled over and stared through the windshield. The photograph hadn't shown how bad it really was. The cabin crouched behind waist-high weeds, its roof sagging under decades of storms. Rust streaked the gutters. Salt had eaten into the siding. Several porch boards had collapsed entirely. For a long moment, Maribel couldn't move. She thought about the apartment she could barely afford. She thought about the baby coming in 2 months. She thought about the doctor's warning. Then she looked at the ruin Beatrice Holloway had supposedly given her as an act of gratitude. Tears burned behind her eyes. "Why would you leave me this?" she whispered. The wind gave no answer. Maribel climbed carefully from the truck and approached the porch. Every step made the rotten boards groan beneath her weight. At the front door, she inserted the brass key. It resisted. She pushed harder. The lock finally turned. When Maribel opened the door, a suffocating smell of mildew, seawater, and decaying wood rushed toward her. She covered her mouth. Inside, dust blanketed everything. Wallpaper hung from the walls in long strips. Furniture sat beneath stained sheets. Dark moisture marks spread across the ceiling. Any sensible person would have closed the door. Maribel almost did. Then the baby kicked. She placed both hands over her belly. "I know," she whispered, her voice trembling. "It isn't much." She looked around again. This time, she didn't see only decay. She saw walls she wouldn't have to pay rent for, a roof that might be repaired, a small bedroom where she could place a crib. Maybe this wasn't the rescue she had prayed for. Maybe it was simply the only chance she was going to get. Maribel wiped her tears away. "All right," she whispered. "We'll make it ours." She had no idea that Beatrice had left her far more than a broken cabin. Because beneath layers of dirt, salt, and decades-old wax, the floor itself was hiding a clue. And Maribel was only days away from uncovering it. For the next 6 days, Maribel Hayes lived 2 separate lives. Before sunrise, she was still the invisible woman cleaning other people's homes, scrubbing spotless countertops, folding expensive towels, and quietly watching families enjoy the kind of security she had always dreamed of giving her own child. But every afternoon, after finishing her shifts, Maribel drove to 17 Gull Point Road. The cabin was worse than she had first realized. Rain had found its way through several sections of the roof. Salt air had corroded the window frames. Mold crept across one bedroom wall, and the kitchen cabinets smelled so strongly of mildew that Maribel had to drag them outside. Friends told her to give up. Even Elliot Mercer warned her that repairing the property might cost more than it was worth. But Maribel had nowhere else to go. Every dollar in her savings account was already spoken for, and with her baby due in less than 2 months, desperation had become stronger than exhaustion. So she cleaned. She wore rubber gloves and an old respirator mask. She hauled ruined furniture outside piece by piece. She scrubbed walls, opened windows, removed water-damaged curtains, and filled dozens of heavy trash bags. At night, her hands cramped so badly she could barely hold a fork. Still, the next afternoon, she returned. "This is going to be our home," she whispered whenever the work felt impossible. By the 7th day, Maribel reached the main living room. The hardwood floor was buried beneath decades of dirt and a thick, yellowed layer of old wax near the stone fireplace. The surface had become almost black. She tried ordinary floor cleaner. Nothing. She scrubbed harder. Still nothing. Finally, Maribel remembered a nearly full container of industrial wax stripper she had found in the storage room of one of the houses she cleaned. Her employer had been preparing to throw it away and had told her she could take it. That afternoon, she brought it to Gull Point. Maribel opened the windows, pulled on protective gloves, and began working carefully in small sections. The chemical softened the old wax almost immediately. She dropped to her knees and began scrubbing. Slowly, something beautiful emerged. Wood. Real hardwood. Dark, honey-colored boards hidden beneath decades of neglect. For the first time since inheriting the cabin, Maribel smiled. "Well, look at you," she whispered. She moved closer to the fireplace. Another section. Then another. Sweat gathered beneath her hair, despite the November cold. Her back ached, and twice she had to stop when the baby shifted sharply inside her. "Just a little longer," she murmured. Then her brush stopped. Maribel frowned. Beneath the dissolving wax was a dark line. At first, she assumed it was a crack. She scrubbed around it. The line continued. Straight. Too straight. Maribel's heartbeat changed. She wiped away more grime. A second line appeared several inches away. Then a third. Together, they formed the outline of something almost rectangular. Maribel sat back on her heels. The surrounding floorboards ran lengthwise across the room, but these boards had been cut differently. Someone had altered this section of the floor. Deliberately. She ran her fingers along the edge. One plank moved. Barely. But Maribel felt it. She pressed again. A faint creak came from underneath. Her exhaustion disappeared. She grabbed a flashlight and lowered her face toward the floor. there a narrow gap beside the hearth. Maribel's thoughts raced. Maybe it was an old repair. Maybe pipes were underneath. Maybe termites had destroyed the foundation. She almost laughed at herself. A hidden treasure. That belonged in movies, not in the life of a housekeeper with overdue bills. Then she noticed something else. Near one end of the loose plank was a tiny indentation beneath the remaining wax. Maribel scrubbed it carefully. A symbol emerged. 3 small circles connected by a curved line. She froze. She had seen that symbol before. Years earlier, while cleaning Beatrice Holloway's bedroom, Maribel had noticed the same unusual mark engraved on an antique silver locket Beatrice always kept beside her bed. When Maribel had once asked about it, Beatrice had immediately closed her hand around the locket. Some things, the elderly woman had said quietly, should only be found by someone patient enough to look beneath the surface. At the time, Maribel thought Beatrice was simply being eccentric. Now, kneeling inside the abandoned cabin, those words returned with terrifying clarity. Look beneath the surface. Maribel stared at the loose floorboard. No way. Her hands began trembling. She searched the kitchen and found an old flathead screwdriver and a rusted pry bar among the tools Beatrice had left behind. Returning to the fireplace, Maribel carefully pushed the screwdriver into the narrow gap. The plank refused to move. She tried again. Nothing. She shifted her weight and pulled harder. Pain shot through her lower back. Maribel stopped immediately, breathing heavily, one hand protecting her belly. She knew she shouldn't continue. Not alone. Not 7 months pregnant. But something inside her refused to walk away. For 38 years, every door in Maribel's life seemed to have been locked from the other side. Poverty had followed her childhood. Debt had followed her marriage. Grief had followed her husband's death. And now, when she was finally responsible for another human life, she had been given a collapsing house everyone else considered worthless. Maybe there was nothing beneath that board. But she had to know. Maribel repositioned the pry bar and applied slow, careful pressure. The wood groaned. Then, crack! The plank lifted. A breath of cold, stale air escaped from beneath the floor. Maribel dropped the tool. There was a hollow space underneath. She aimed the flashlight into the darkness. At first, she saw only dirt and old foundation stones. Then the beam caught something. Metal. Maribel stopped breathing. Deep beneath the floor, wrapped in what looked like layers of thick protective material, was the corner of an old trunk. Not garbage. Not plumbing. A trunk? Someone had hidden it there. Maribel remained motionless, staring into the darkness as the ocean thundered against the cliffs outside. Suddenly, Beatrice's strange inheritance didn't feel accidental anymore. The worthless cabin, the unusual floor, the symbol, the words spoken years ago. They were connected. Maribel placed a trembling hand over her belly. What did you leave us, Beatrice? She didn't know the answer yet. But when that trunk finally came out of the darkness, Maribel would discover that the poorest woman in the room at Beatrice Holloway's will reading might have inherited something none of the wealthy relatives knew existed. And what was inside would change her child's future forever. Maribel Hayes remained on her knees beside the open floorboard, staring into the darkness beneath the cabin. For several seconds, she couldn't move. The flashlight trembled in her hand, its narrow beam resting on the metal corner of the hidden trunk. Every reasonable thought told her to stop. She was 7 months pregnant. The trunk looked heavy. The floor around the opening was old and unstable. But another thought was stronger. Beatrice wanted me to find this. Maribel called her neighbor, Dylan Reeves, a retired dock worker who had helped her carry supplies to the cabin earlier that week. 20 minutes later, his pickup appeared through the fog. When Dylan saw the opening beside the fireplace, his expression changed. I wasn't put there by accident. Together, they widened the opening carefully. The trunk had been wrapped in thick protective material and sealed against moisture, using an old rope. Dylan pulled while Maribel guided it away from the foundation stones. When it finally scraped across the living room floor, both of them stared at it. It was smaller than Maribel expected, and unbelievably heavy. A faded brass plate was attached to the lid. Holloway, 1874. Maribel's pulse quickened. Dylan stepped back. Whatever this is, you should probably have a witness. Maribel nodded. Then she noticed a tiny keyhole beneath the brass plate. Her thoughts immediately went to the envelope Elliot Mercer had given her. Inside it, along with the deed and the large brass house key, had been a second key, tiny, blackened with age. At the time, neither of them knew what had opened. Maribel rushed to her purse. Her fingers shook as she inserted the little key. It fit perfectly. Click. The sound seemed impossibly loud. Maribel lifted the lid. For a moment, neither she nor Dylan spoke. Inside were several cloth bundles, leather folders, and rows of small cylindrical containers. Maribel carefully opened one bundle. Something metallic rolled into her palm. Gold! An old coin, heavier than any modern coin she had ever held. She opened another bundle. More. Dozens of them. Some were dated in the 1800s. Maribel stared at Dylan. Are these real? I wouldn't touch anything else, he whispered. The following morning, Elliot arranged for a numismatic specialist and an attorney experienced in historical estates to examine the discovery. Maribel sat across from them with both hands wrapped around a paper cup of water. The specialist studied the coins individually. Minutes stretched into an hour. Finally, he removed his glasses. Mrs. Hayes! Several of these appear to be rare 19th-century American gold coins. Maribel swallowed. How much are they worth? I can't give you an exact figure without authentication and grading. He paused. But we're not talking about a few $1,000s. Maribel felt the room tilt beneath her. Then came the documents. Inside the leather folders were old deeds, survey maps, tax records, and correspondence tracing the Holloway family's ownership of land along Gull Point. One document was especially important. The cabin wasn't sitting on the tiny parcel Maribel had assumed she'd inherited. The original property boundaries extended considerably farther along the coastline. Elliot looked stunned. If these records are legally valid and the title history can be confirmed, the land itself could be worth far more than anyone realized. Maribel couldn't speak. For days, she had looked at that cabin and seen failure. Rotten wood. Mold. Another problem she couldn't afford to solve. Now she understood that she had been looking only at the surface. Just like everyone at the will reading? They had laughed because they saw a worthless shack. Beatrice had seen something else. Maribel suddenly remembered one particular evening years earlier. She had been cleaning Beatrice's kitchen when the elderly woman asked, "What would you do if you had enough money to stop working tomorrow?" Maribel had laughed. "I wouldn't stop." "Why not?" "Because I wouldn't know how." Then Maribel had looked down at her hands. "But I'd make sure my child never had to choose between groceries and electricity the way my mother did." Beatrice had said nothing. She had simply watched her. Until this moment, Maribel had forgotten that conversation. Now tears filled her eyes. Maybe Beatrice hadn't forgotten. That evening, Maribel returned alone to Gull Point. The cabin was still damaged. The windows still rattled. The roof still needed repairs. Nothing about the building had physically changed. But Maribel had... She walked into the unfinished nursery and stood beside the window overlooking the Atlantic. For the first time in months, she allowed herself to imagine a future without fear. A safe crib, a warm bedroom, food in the refrigerator without calculating every dollar, a college fund, a childhood without hearing whispered arguments about overdue bills. Maribel placed both hands over her belly. "You're not going to grow up the way I did," she whispered. Her voice broke. She thought of her mother counting coins at the kitchen table. She remembered wearing second-hand shoes that were too small because there was no money for another pair. She remembered the humiliation of pretending she wasn't hungry at school. And she realized something that made her cry harder than the discovery of the gold ever had. The inheritance wasn't simply giving Maribel money. It was giving her unborn child something no one in her family had possessed for generations. A beginning without debt. But as Maribel stood inside the ruined cabin listening to the waves outside, another realization settled over her. Beatrice hadn't chosen the wealthiest person in the room. She had chosen the woman who knew exactly what it meant to have nothing. And Maribel was beginning to understand that perhaps this inheritance wasn't only meant to change her life. Perhaps it was asking her to decide what kind of person she would become once survival was no longer her only concern. 3 weeks after the trunk was pulled from beneath the floor, Maribel Hayes sat in Elliot Mercer's office again. But this time, nobody was laughing. The gold coins had been authenticated. Several were rare 19th century pieces in remarkable condition, protected for generations by the sealed trunk. The collection alone was worth enough to erase Maribel's debts, repair the cabin, and give her something she had never possessed in 38 years. A financial cushion? But the greater surprise came from the documents. After weeks of title research, historical records, and legal verification, Elliot confirmed that Beatrice Holloway's inheritance included substantially more coastal land than anyone had realized. The neglected cabin wasn't sitting on a worthless scrap of ground. It stood on valuable waterfront property. Elliot pushed a folder across his desk. "These are preliminary estimates," he said carefully. "Nothing is guaranteed until everything is finalized." Maribel opened it. Her eyes moved toward the number, then stopped. She looked again. Her hands began trembling. "Is this really mine?" "If the remaining title work is completed successfully," Elliot replied. "Yes." Maribel closed the folder. She didn't scream. She didn't laugh. She cried. Not because she suddenly imagined expensive cars, jewelry, or vacations. She cried because, for the first time since learning she was pregnant, she knew her baby would have a safe place to sleep. She cried because the hospital bill would not destroy her. She cried because she could buy groceries without secretly adding the prices in her head. And she cried because she no longer had to decide whether keeping a roof over her child's head was worth risking her own health. 2 days later, Maribel did something that terrified her more than opening the hidden trunk. She resigned from her second cleaning shift. Her supervisor stared at her. "You sure you always ask for extra hours?" Maribel looked down at her swollen belly. "That's exactly why I have to stop." Walking out that afternoon felt strange. For years, exhaustion had been proof that she was surviving. Now, for the first time, rest wasn't laziness. It was a choice she was finally allowed to make. But money created questions Maribel had never expected to face. What should she sell? What should she keep? Could someone take advantage of her? What happened if the money disappeared? She remembered families she had cleaned for who earned enormous salaries, yet seemed constantly worried about finances. Maribel refused to exchange one kind of fear for another. So instead of immediately spending the inheritance, she asked Elliot for help finding independent financial and legal professionals. She wanted every document explained in language she understood. She wanted taxes accounted for. She wanted the baby's future protected. And most importantly, she wanted to understand the money herself. "I've spent my whole life being afraid of numbers on bills," she told Elliot. "I don't want to spend the rest of it being afraid of numbers in a bank account." That decision changed everything. Maribel learned about emergency funds, insurance, diversified investments, property taxes, trusts, and long-term planning. For the first time, financial language stopped sounding like something designed for other people. Then came the question of gull point. A developer offered to purchase part of the coastal property. The amount stunned Maribel. Selling everything would have been easy. She could walk away from the rotten cabin forever. But one evening, she returned to number 17. Construction estimates lay on the old kitchen table. Wind rattled the windows, while the Atlantic rolled beneath a pale orange sunset. Maribel walked toward the fireplace. The loose floorboards had been temporarily replaced, but she could still see where the trunk had been hidden. She remembered Beatrice's words. Some things should only be found by someone patient enough to look beneath the surface. Suddenly, Maribel understood what she wanted. She wouldn't erase the place that had changed her life. She would restore it. Not into a mansion. Not into a monument to wealth. Into a home. A contractor named Connor Vale helped her develop a plan to preserve the strongest original beams and stone fireplace while replacing the damaged roof, electrical system, plumbing, insulation, and unsafe flooring. Maribel chose a small upstairs room facing the ocean for the nursery. One afternoon, standing inside its unfinished walls, she imagined holding her child there. Then another thought came to her. She remembered women she had worked beside for years. Women cleaning houses while sick because they couldn't afford a day off. Women who didn't understand credit agreements. Women trapped by debt, afraid of banks, and living one emergency away from losing everything. Maribel knew exactly how that felt. And suddenly, the inheritance seemed larger than her own rescue. What if I could help them learn what I'm learning? She asked Elliot. That question became the beginning of something neither of them had expected. Maribel started planning a small community program for domestic workers and other low-income employees, free workshops on budgeting, savings, debt, workplace resources, and long-term financial planning. She called it the Holloway Harbor Initiative, not because Beatrice had given her gold, but because Beatrice had given her an opportunity, and Maribel was beginning to understand the difference. Months earlier, she had believed security meant having enough money to survive tomorrow. Now she understood something deeper. Real security meant having enough knowledge to shape the years ahead. As Maribel stood outside the cabin one evening, watching workers repair the roof beneath the fading coastal light, the baby moved inside her. She smiled and rested a hand against her belly. "We're going to be okay." Then she looked toward the town in the distance. "For the first time," she added. "And maybe we can help someone else be okay, too." Maribel had discovered a fortune beneath an abandoned floor. But the greatest opportunity it gave her wasn't the chance to become wealthy. It was the chance to break a cycle and make sure the door stayed open for someone coming behind her. 6 months later, morning sunlight poured through the restored windows of the cabin at Gull Point. The place was almost unrecognizable. The collapsing porch had been rebuilt. The salt-damaged siding had been replaced, the roof reinforced, and the old stone fireplace carefully restored. Inside, warm oak floors stretched beneath white walls, while wide windows framed the Atlantic like living paintings. But Maribel Hayes had changed even more than the house. She stood barefoot in the kitchen, holding her 3-month-old daughter, Juniper, against her chest. Juniper was healthy. That fact still felt like a miracle. Maribel had given birth several weeks after leaving her second job. For the first time in years, she had been able to follow her doctor's advice, rest when her body demanded it, and prepare for motherhood without calculating how many cleaning shifts she would have to work to cover the hospital bill. Yet something unexpected had happened after the money arrived. Maribel hadn't immediately felt safe. Some nights, she still woke at 2 Sotruanura, convinced she had forgotten to pay the rent. At grocery stores, she automatically reached for the cheapest food before remembering she didn't have to. She kept old cleaning gloves beneath the kitchen sink. She couldn't bring herself to throw them away. They reminded her of who she had been. Or perhaps who she still was. One rainy afternoon, Elliot Mercer visited the cabin and found Maribel sitting at the kitchen table surrounded by financial statements. "You've checked those numbers 3 times, he said. 4. Elliot smiled gently. "The money isn't disappearing overnight." Maribel looked toward Juniper, sleeping nearby. "I know," but her expression said otherwise. For most of her life, poverty had taught Maribel that security could vanish without warning. One illness, one broken car, one missed paycheck, one phone call. She had spent decades preparing for disaster. Learning how to live without expecting one was much harder. That realization changed the way she approached the Holloway Harbor initiative. At first, Maribel imagined simply paying professionals to teach financial workshops. But when she attended the first meeting, she saw familiar faces. Women she had cleaned beside, hotel housekeepers, home health aides, single mothers, older workers approaching retirement with almost nothing saved. Maribel stood at the back of the community room while a financial counselor explained emergency savings. Then a woman named Hazel Moreno raised her hand. "How are we supposed to save 3 months of expenses when we can't even save $300? The room became silent. Maribel knew that silence. She had lived inside it. The counselor began answering with percentages and budgeting strategies. Maribel stepped forward. "Can I say something?" Everyone turned. She looked at Hazel. "Start with $10. Hazel frowned. $10 won't save me." "No," Maribel replied. "But $10 proves you can begin." Maribel pulled out a chair and sat beside her. 3 months ago, I was afraid to buy an extra carton of eggs because I didn't know what bill would come next. So don't let anyone make you feel ashamed because you can't save thousands of dollars." Several women looked up. Maribel continued, "Financial security isn't one giant decision. Sometimes it starts with $10 you refuse to spend." That afternoon changed the program, and it changed Maribel. She realized people didn't need someone wealthy standing at a podium telling them what they were doing wrong. They needed someone who remembered. Someone who understood what it felt like to open an electricity bill with shaking hands. Someone who knew the embarrassment of declining a doctor's appointment because the copay was too high. Someone who had stood in a grocery aisle putting food back. Maribel began attending every workshop. Then she started speaking. The woman who once lowered her eyes when wealthy homeowners entered a room now stood before groups of strangers and told her story without shame. She learned to negotiate. She learned to ask questions. She learned that saying, "I don't understand, explain it again," wasn't evidence of ignorance. It was power. Within months, the Holloway Harbor Initiative expanded. Local accountants volunteered their time. Credit counselors joined the workshops. A community bank helped create small emergency savings programs for participating workers. Maribel also established a modest assistance fund for women facing sudden crises. But she created one rule. The foundation would never treat people like charity cases. "People don't need pity," she told the volunteers. "They need tools, dignity, and a fair chance." One evening, after the final workshop of the month, Maribel returned to Gull Point. Juniper was asleep against her shoulder. Maribel walked into the living room and stopped beside the fireplace. The original floorboard had been preserved. So had the small symbol carved into the wood. 3 circles connected by a curved line. Maribel touched it gently. Months earlier, she had knelt in this exact spot, exhausted, frightened, and almost broke. She had believed finding the trunk would solve everything. Now she understood the truth. The gold had changed her circumstances, but it hadn't changed her life by itself. That required something harder. Maribel had to stop seeing herself as powerless. She had to learn that her years of hardship weren't proof that she had failed. They had given her an understanding money couldn't buy. Juniper stirred in her arms. Maribel looked down at her daughter's peaceful face. "You'll never remember the woman I was before you were born," she whispered. Then she smiled through tears. But I hope someday you'll understand why she fought so hard. Outside, waves struck the rocks beneath the moonlight. The cabin had survived decades of storms. So had Maribel. And now, neither of them was simply surviving anymore. They had become foundations for something stronger, something that could last long after the treasure was gone. 5 years later, the old cabin at 17 Gull Point Road no longer looked like something the ocean was waiting to swallow. On a clear September morning, sunlight spilled across its cedar siding and restored porch. Beach grass moved gently in the wind, and beyond the windows, the Atlantic shimmered beneath a cloudless Massachusetts sky. Inside, Maribel Hayes stood quietly at the kitchen window. She was 43 now, and across the yard, her 5-year-old daughter, Juniper, was running barefoot through the grass, laughing as she chased a red kite toward the shoreline. Maribel watched her and felt her throat tighten. There were moments when the past returned without warning. She could still remember waking at 4:40 every morning in that cramped apartment above the laundromat. She remembered cleaning enormous homes while 7 months pregnant. She remembered swollen feet, an aching back, and counting the few dollars left in her checking account. Most of all, she remembered the fear. The constant, exhausting fear that one unexpected bill could destroy everything. Now, her daughter was running toward the ocean without knowing what that kind of fear felt like. And that was the greatest fortune Maribel had ever received. "Mom, look." Juniper held the kite higher. Maribel stepped onto the porch. "I see you, sweetheart." Juniper laughed and ran faster. Maribel smiled. 5 years earlier, she had promised the unborn child inside her that they would somehow be okay. She hadn't known whether she could keep that promise. Now she understood that okay had become something far greater than she had imagined. The Holloway Harbor Initiative had grown beyond a few financial workshops. It now served hundreds of domestic workers, caregivers, hotel employees, and other low-income families throughout the coastal communities surrounding Rockport. The program offered free financial education, emergency planning, career resources, and access to professional counseling. Some participants had opened savings accounts for the first time. Others had escaped predatory debt. A few had started small businesses, and several had eventually returned as volunteers. Among them was Hazel Moreno, the woman who once asked how anyone struggling to survive could possibly build savings, now stood in front of new participants teaching the lesson Maribel had taught her. "Start with $10, Hazel would say. Then she would smile, because $10 isn't the destination. It's proof that you've started walking." Every time Maribel heard those words, she thought of Beatrice Holloway. She often wondered whether Beatrice had imagined any of this. Had she known exactly what was beneath those floorboards? Had she deliberately left clues? Or had she simply trusted that Maribel would be stubborn enough to keep looking when everyone else saw nothing but decay? There were questions Maribel would never be able to answer. But one thing had become certain. Beatrice hadn't simply left her property. She had left her a test. At the will reading, wealthy relatives had laughed at the abandoned cabin because they measured value by appearance. Maribel had almost made the same mistake. She had stood outside number 17 and seen rotten boards, broken windows, and another burden she couldn't afford. But desperation had forced her to stay. Patience had made her clean. And courage had made her lift that first floorboard. What she discovered underneath changed far more than her bank account. That afternoon, Maribel drove Juniper into town for the 5th anniversary gathering of the Holloway Harbor Initiative. Dozens of families filled the community center. Near the entrance hung photographs documenting the program's history. Maribel stopped before one. It showed her 5 years earlier. Pregnant, exhausted, standing outside the ruined cabin in an old coat. Juniper pointed at it. "Mommy, is that you?" Maribel laughed softly. "Yes." "You look sad." Maribel stared at the photograph. I was scared. Why? The question was innocent. Juniper had never known overdue rent. She had never watched her mother skip dinner so there would be enough food for tomorrow. She had never fallen asleep listening to someone calculate which bill could wait another week. Maribel crouched beside her. Because I didn't know what was going to happen to us. Juniper thought about that. But we're okay now. Maribel's eyes filled with tears. Yes, baby. She pulled her daughter close. We're okay now. That evening, after everyone had gone home, Maribel returned to Gull Point. The sunset painted the Atlantic gold. She walked into the living room and stopped beside the fireplace. The old carved floorboard remained exactly where she had found it. Maribel could have replaced it years ago. She never did. She wanted Juniper to grow up seeing it. Not because treasure had once been hidden underneath, but because Maribel wanted her daughter to remember something far more important. She knelt and traced the 3 connected circles with her fingertips. Then she finally understood what the symbol meant to her. 1 circle was the past, 1 was the present, and 1 was everything that could come next. Maribel looked towards the window, where Juniper was collecting seashells outside. 5 years ago, she believed Beatrice Holloway had rescued her. Now she knew better. Beatrice had opened a door. Maribel had chosen to walk through it. The inheritance gave her security. But compassion gave that inheritance purpose. And perhaps that was why the treasure had remained hidden for so long. Sometimes the greatest gifts aren't waiting for the richest person. They're waiting for the person who understands what it means to have nothing and still chooses, when given everything, to reach back and lift someone else. Maribel smiled as Juniper ran towards the house. The abandoned cabin had once seemed like the cruelest inheritance imaginable. Instead, beneath its ruined floors, Maribel had found a future. Not just for herself, not just for her daughter, but for hundreds of people who had once believed that a better life belonged only to someone else. And that was a legacy worth far more than gold. Maribel's story reminds us that the most valuable things in life don't always arrive wrapped like blessings. Sometimes they arrive as broken houses, unexpected responsibilities, closed doors, or moments when giving up feels easier than taking one more step. Everyone saw the abandoned cabin and called it worthless. Maribel saw the same rotting walls, but she stayed. She cleaned. She searched. And eventually, she discovered something extraordinary beneath what everyone else had ignored. But the gold wasn't the greatest treasure. The real treasure was what Maribel chose to do after finding it. She could have walked away from her past and never looked back. Instead, she remembered that the people still working double shifts, counting grocery money, fearing the next bill, and wondering whether life would ever change. So she reached back. And that's the lesson worth remembering. Your hardest chapter may someday become the reason you can help someone survive theirs. If this story touched your heart, don't leave without doing something meaningful. Subscribe to the channel because the next story may carry the message you or someone you love needs to hear. Like this video so more people can discover Maribel's journey. And in the comments, answer this question. If life suddenly gave you a second chance, would you use it only to change your own future? Or would you help change someone else's too? Share this story with someone who is struggling today. Because sometimes, one story is all it takes to remind a person. Don't stop digging. Your life may still have something extraordinary waiting beneath the surface.